The shootout at the OK Corral is one of those stories where you think you know it, but the more you learn about it, the crazier the story becomes.
The Wild West was not just dangerous, it was deeply messed up. In some towns, you lost your gun the moment you arrived. In others, the streets were so filthy that people were dying faster from disease than from bullets. Entire towns could explode with life, then collapse and empty out almost overnight. And sometimes the worst danger was not out in the open. It was hiding in places that looked completely normal. This is the uncensored truth about real Old West towns. Number 16. No guns in town. In real Western towns, a man could not always ride in with a pistol on his hip, walk straight into town, and act as if nobody could stop him. Places like Dodge City and Tombstone had rules against carrying guns inside town. The reason was simple. Town leaders knew that once you packed a street with strangers, bars, gambling, horses, anger, and alcohol, one bad moment could turn deadly fast. Tombstone made that clear in 1881 with Ordinance No. 9. The law said it was illegal to carry a deadly weapon inside the city unless you had written permission. If you were entering town, you were expected to leave your gun within a reasonable time at a hotel, stable, saloon, or another safe place, then pick it up when you left. Dodge City pushed the same message in a very direct way. Signs at the edge of town warned people that carrying firearms was strictly banned. That changes the whole picture. These towns were not trying to prove how fearless they were by letting everyone stay armed all day. They were trying to stop the kind of sudden, stupid violence that could wreck business and scare families away. Shop owners wanted customers. Investors wanted stable streets. Town officials wanted order. The real Western town was still rough, but it was not built on the idea that every man should walk around loaded every second of the day. That is also why Tombstone matters so much. The fight near the OK Corral did not happen because the town had no rules. It happened in a town that already had a law against carrying weapons, and Virgil Earp moved to enforce it by trying to disarm the cowboys. That means one of the most famous shootouts in American history was tied directly to a town trying to control guns, not praise them. Number 15. The Inn of Death. One of the darkest truths about the Old West is that danger did not always look like danger. Sometimes it looked like a family place where a tired traveler could get a hot meal, rest for the night, and move on in the morning. In southeast Kansas, near Cherryvale, the Bender family set up exactly that kind of stop along the Osage Trail in the early 1870s. They had a small store, a place for people to eat, and a place where travelers could stay. On the surface, it looked ordinary. That is what made it so deadly. Between 1871 and 1873, travelers kept disappearing in that area. At first, that did not sound impossible. The frontier was rough, people moved alone, and families could go a long time without hearing from someone on the road. But the number of missing people kept building. Then Dr. William York disappeared after he went looking for another missing man and his little daughter. That raised the alarm in a much bigger way, because York was known, respected, and connected to powerful people. Soon, pressure built to search every place along that road. When people finally searched the Bender place in 1873, the family was gone. What they found turned the story into one of the ugliest in Western history. The farm had been abandoned. A search of the property led to bodies buried in the garden and orchard. The victims had been killed with blows to the head and cuts to the throat. Investigators later believed the family had lured travelers in, seated them in the cabin, attacked them from behind, then robbed and buried them on the property. In all, nearly a dozen people were linked to the killings, and some later estimates ran even higher. Number 14. The railroad picked winners. In the real Old West, a railroad line was not just a way to travel. It was a decision about which town would grow and which town would start dying. Once the tracks came through, everything changed. People could arrive faster, goods could come in faster. Cattle, ore, grain, and other products could be shipped out faster. Mail moved faster. News moved faster. A town on the line suddenly had a real shot at becoming rich, busy, and important. A town left off the line could be stuck watching all of that pass it by. That is why railroad access meant so much. A western town needed more than brave people and big dreams. It needed supplies, markets, workers, tools, lumber, and steady movement. The railroad brought all of that. It tied small western settlements to bigger cities and made trade possible on a whole new scale. That is also why railroad towns could explode so fast. The cruel part was what happened to towns the railroad skipped. New Philadelphia in Illinois is a clear example. It was a real town that had grown near important roads and rivers, but when the railroad bypassed it in 1869, the town went into decline. People moved away for jobs and better chances elsewhere, and the community eventually disappeared. Nicodemus in Kansas was hit in a similar way. Its population began to fall after the Missouri Pacific Railroad bypassed it in 1887, and business shifted to another town that had the rail connection instead. Sometimes towns fought back because they knew exactly what was at stake. Wichita was badly threatened when the Santa Fe line first bypassed it and went through Newton instead. Local boosters pushed hard, raised money for a spur line, and kept the town in the game. Number 13. Dirt that could kill you. Real Old West towns did not just look rough. A lot of them smelled rough, felt rough, and could make you sick fast. People love talking about shootouts. But daily life in many Western camps and towns was filthy in a much less glamorous way. Men slept in tents or crude shelters, worked long hours, ate badly, wore the same dirty clothes for too long, and lived with fleas, lice, mud, and waste all around them. Many places grew so fast that basic cleanliness never had a chance to catch up. That is what made town life so dangerous. It was not just the hard work. It was the setting. Miners and camp workers often threw up rough living spaces near streams, packed together in places that were already dirty and badly supplied. Food was poor, water could be bad, and people often treated the ground around them like a dump. One account from the gold camps said sickness hit so many newcomers that even people who arrived healthy often got sick soon after. Another described miners living in tents, exposed to cold, damp weather, poor food, and bad water. In camps like these, getting worn down was easy. Staying healthy was the hard part. Then came the diseases people feared most. Cholera spread through food and water contaminated by human waste, and it could kill with terrifying speed. People could seem fine in the morning and be dead by noon. Dysentery was another misery people knew well. It brought bloody diarrhea, fever, nausea, and cramps. And in a time when doctors still did not understand many of these illnesses, a bad case could turn deadly. Typhoid also spread through dirty food, dirty water, and unsanitary living conditions. In a western town already full of stress, crowding, and bad habits, disease could move like a hidden enemy. Number 12. One spark and a town was gone. A lot of real Old West towns were built so fast that they were almost asking for fire. Buildings stood close together. Most were made of dry wood. Inside them were oil lamps, candles, stoves, fireplaces, and open flames used for cooking, heat, and light. That meant a town could look busy and alive at sunset, then be half gone by sunrise. In places like that, fire was not some rare disaster. It was one of the biggest threats hanging over daily life. Deadwood shows that truth perfectly. On September 26, 1879, a fire started in a bakery on Sherman Street and raced through town. More than 300 buildings were destroyed, and around 2,000 people were left homeless. That is a huge number when you remember how young and rough the town already was. Deadwood had grown fast during the Black Hills Gold Rush, and like many boom towns, it was packed with wooden buildings thrown up quickly to meet demand. Once the flames caught, the town did not have much standing in the way. What makes Deadwood even more revealing is what happened after. People rebuilt the town in about 6 months, and many of the new buildings went up in brick and stone instead of wood. Then there was the Gem Theater, one of the town's most famous places. It had already been damaged by fire in the summer of 1879, then was destroyed in the Great Fire that hit Deadwood that September. It was rebuilt, but in 1899 it burned again for the third time. When firefighters got there, they found that the hydrant wrenches had been stolen, so they could do little but watch it burn. That says everything about how fragile these towns could be. A place could survive gunfights, crooked men, and hard winters, but one spark, one mistake, or one missing tool could wipe out years of life in a single night. Number 11. Women who ran the town. One of the biggest lies about real Old West towns is that women were just standing in the background while men did everything that mattered. That is not how those towns really worked. In a lot of places, women were earning money, running businesses, feeding workers, taking in boarders, playing cards for cash, and finding ways to survive in towns that could be brutal to anybody without steady income. The West opened those doors not because it was kind, but because life there was unstable and people had to do whatever worked. Poker Alice is one of the clearest examples. She ended up in Deadwood after being widowed and broke, and she turned to poker to support herself. She built a name as a calm, straight-faced gambler who rarely lost. Men came from all around just for the chance to beat her, and most of them failed. And Poker Alice was not some one-off miracle. Across the West, women found ways to turn skill, nerve, and daily work into survival. Some ran boarding houses that kept mining towns alive by feeding men and giving them a place to sleep. Mary Ballou and her husband did exactly that in the California gold country, and stories like hers show how important that kind of work was. A rough town could not run on miners alone. It needed meals, rooms, laundry, supplies, and somebody keeping the whole place going when the dust settled at night. Number 10. The Chinatown Hollywood left out. One of the biggest lies about real Old West towns is how often Chinese people get pushed out of the picture. In a lot of Western towns, they were not some tiny footnote standing off to the side. They were part of daily town life. They cooked food, ran stores, washed clothes, sold goods, and built business spaces that helped towns work. If you take them out of the story, you are not looking at the real West anymore. Deadwood is a strong example because it breaks the movie version fast. The town had a large Chinese community, and they were doing far more than the old stereotype people still repeat. Records from Deadwood show that Chinese residents ran a sizable number of stores and restaurants, even though many outsiders tried to reduce them to laundry work alone. Deadwood was not just miners, gamblers, and gunmen. It was also a place where Chinese workers and business owners helped feed people, serve customers, and keep the town moving. That was not only true in Deadwood. Across the West, Chinese communities formed business districts and Chinatowns that became social and commercial centers for the people who lived there. Chinese-owned businesses often included laundries, groceries, restaurants, and shops selling goods both to Chinese customers and to the wider town. In small towns and larger ones, these places gave people work, community, and a way to survive in a land that could be harsh even before racism made it worse. And that pressure was always there. Chinese people in Western towns were often distrusted, pushed aside, and treated like outsiders, even while their labor and businesses helped those same towns function. Number 9. When camels walked the West. One of the strangest truths about the real Old West is that for a while, camels were part of it. The United States Army brought camels into the Southwest in the 1850s because it needed a better way to move supplies across hard, dry land. The land was rough, water was scarce, and long trips with horses and mules could be brutal. Camels looked like a serious answer. Camp Verde in Texas became the heart of that experiment. The Army tested the animals because they could carry heavy loads and handle desert travel better than many other pack animals. The whole thing was backed at a high level and treated as real military business, not some side stunt. The camels proved they could work. They could move through harsh country, haul gear, and deal with the dry Southwest in ways that impressed the officers who used them. Then the Civil War wrecked the plan. The Army's focus changed. Camp Verde fell into Confederate hands, and the Camel Project lost its momentum. By the end of the war, the government was done with it. The California camels were sold first, and the surviving Camp Verde camels were sold at auction in 1866. That should have been the end of the story, but it was not. Some camels went into private hands. Some were used in freight work, mining, and other civilian jobs. Some were abandoned, some escaped, and once that happened, the West got even stranger. For years after, people kept reporting camel sightings in Texas, Arizona, and other parts of the Southwest. Number 8. When the town became the law. One of the darkest truths about real Old West towns is that sometimes people stopped waiting for the law and decided to become the law themselves. In rough mining towns, fear could build fast. If robberies kept happening, if people kept turning up dead, and if the sheriff or the courts looked weak, scared citizens did not always wait for a proper trial. They formed vigilance committees instead. These were self-made groups that took over the jobs of police, judge, and executioner all at once. That is what happened in the gold camp world around Virginia City, Montana in 1863. A real vigilante oath from that time shows just how serious it was. It was signed by 23 men in December of 1863, and it talked about catching thieves while keeping the group's secrets. That one document says a lot. People believed crime had gotten bad enough that normal law was not doing the job, so they built a hidden group of their own. Once those groups formed, things moved fast. Vigilantes did not work like a slow court with careful rules. They grabbed suspects, held quick hearings, and often ended things with hanging or banishment. In Montana, the groups tied to Virginia City and nearby camps became famous for exactly that. Some people at the time believed they made life safer by driving criminals out. But the harder truth is that once a town gets used to justice without the usual legal process, fear starts deciding who lives, who dies, and who gets called guilty. Number 7. The hat Hollywood got wrong. If you walked into a real Old West town, the street would not look the way most people expect. Movies trained people to think the West was a sea of wide-brimmed cowboy hats, all shaped the same way, all worn by the same kind of hard man. But real Western towns looked more mixed than that. One of the biggest surprises is that the hat most people now treat as the symbol of the West was not the only hat shaping everyday Western life. The derby, also called the bowler, was everywhere in the late 19th century. As famous as the Stetson became, the best-selling hat of the late 19th century, both east and west of the Mississippi, was still the derby. That changes the whole look of the Old West. The derby was not some rare city hat that never touched frontier life. It was part of the real mix people saw on Western streets. Lawman and gambler Bat Masterson is one of the best-known examples tied to that look. That does not mean the cowboy hat was fake. It was very real, and Stetson's Boss of the Plains became hugely popular after John B. Stetson began making it in the 1860s. But the wider truth is more interesting than the movie version. Western towns were full of different kinds of people doing different jobs, and they dressed that way too. Some wore derbies, some wore slouch hats, some wore Stetsons. So why do people remember only the cowboy hat? Because it won the memory war. Buffalo Bill helped spread that image in his Wild West shows, and later movies pushed it even harder until one hat came to stand for the whole region. Number 6. The fake front of Main Street. A lot of real Old West towns were putting on a show from the very beginning. One of the clearest signs was the false front. That was the tall, flat face you saw from the street, even when the building behind it was smaller, simpler, and rougher than it looked. That look became one of the most famous parts of a Western town, so much so that when people build a fake Western street today, this is usually one of the first things they copy. The trick was simple. The front wall rose above the real roof line and hid the shape of the roof behind it. In some cases, the false front made a one-story building look taller and more important than it really was. In others, it gave a whole street a cleaner, stronger look by making one rough building line up better with the next one. From the road, that could make a hurried boomtown look more settled, more proud, and more permanent than it really was. That mattered because Western towns were selling confidence. A place built in a rush still needed to impress travelers, investors, shop owners, and anybody thinking about staying. A false front was a cheap way to do that. It gave dignity to a fast-growing town and helped create a steady-looking business street even when the buildings were plain and quickly built. A lot of these structures were made for stores and other business use, which makes sense. Number 5. Bars before buildings. In a lot of real Old West towns, the saloon came before almost everything else. Before proper hotels, before schools, before churches, and sometimes before the town even looked like a real town, there was already a place to drink, gamble, hear news, and spend money. They were not built slowly and neatly. They were thrown together in a rush, usually because somebody found gold, silver, or some other chance to get rich fast. That is why the first saloons were often so rough. In early mining camps, many buildings were just tents or very simple log structures. In other places, stores were described as little more than canvas tents stretched over wooden platform floors. That means the early Western saloon was not always some polished wooden bar with nice doors and a fancy counter. That rough start also explains why saloons mattered so much. Early mining settlements were mostly filled with men chasing work, money, and luck. The first businesses in those places were shaped around that reality. Saloons, general stores, food, and lodging came first because those were the things people needed right away. In some towns, one simple commercial building even held several kinds of business at once. A man could drink there, eat there, hear the latest news there, and maybe find a bed or a card game in the same part of town. So when people picture a Western saloon, they should not always picture a grand place from a movie set. They should picture something louder, rougher, and more temporary. Number 4. The burros that outlived the boom. In Oatman, Arizona, the mining days never fully left. They still walk right down the middle of town. The place is famous for its burros, and they are not there as some fake roadside act made up for tourists. They are descendants of the pack animals miners once used when this was a hard-working gold town in the Black Mountains. Today they wander the main street, stick their heads through the rails, and make the whole town feel like the past never really packed up and left. Oatman even has more burros than people. The town itself rose fast, just like so many real Old West places did. In 1915, gold in the Black Mountains triggered a rush that turned Oatman from a small tent camp into a full boom town. In only about a year, the population jumped to more than 3,500 people. The name Oatman adds a darker layer to the story. The town was named after Olive Oatman, whose story had become famous across the West long before the mining boom. In 1851, when she was still a girl, her family was attacked while traveling west in what is now Arizona. Olive was taken captive, later lived with the Mojave, and returned to white society in 1856. Her name stayed in the region, and when the mining town rose years later, it carried that name with it. Number 3. A town could die of thirst. A real Old West town did not just need gold, luck, or tough men. It needed water. Without it, nothing worked. People could not drink. Animals could not last. Mills could not run. Mines could not keep going. In much of the West, that was a serious problem from the start. The land was dry, streams were often far apart, and water flow could change a lot. That is one reason water became such a big fight in the West. People needed clear rules for a scarce resource, and out of the mining boom came the rule people summed up as first in time, first in right, meaning the first person to claim and use water had the strongest claim to keep using it. In a dry region, whoever controlled water controlled work, food, animals, mills, and the future of the town itself. A place could have a rich mine and still be in trouble if it could not keep enough water moving where it was needed. Virginia City, Nevada, shows this perfectly. It sat in high desert country, and its local water supply was badly limited. Early on, wells and springs gave the town some water, and some of it was even sold from carts moving through town. But that was never going to be enough for a mining town growing at full speed. The people needed water. The mines needed water. The mills needed water. As the population climbed and the work expanded, the shortage became impossible to ignore. That is why water systems became such a big deal in Western towns. Ditches, pipes, flumes, tanks, and reservoirs were not side details. They were the difference between a town that could keep pretending it had a future and one that would start choking on its own limits. Number 2. The real war in Tombstone. The fight near the OK Corral was not some sudden burst of madness between a few angry men. It was the final break in a feud that had been building inside one of the fastest-growing silver towns in the West. Silver found near Tombstone in 1877 turned the place into a boom town, and by 1881 it had more than 7,000 people. Money was pouring in, new people kept arriving, and everybody wanted a piece of what the town was becoming. That was the real pressure behind the famous gunfight. The Earps were not just clean-cut lawmen trying to save a wild town. Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan did wear badges, but they also had money tied up in mines, saloons, bartending, and private security work. On the other side were the cowboys, including the Clantons and the McClorys, a loose group known for cattle rustling and other crimes. Beef was in demand in fast-growing towns, and stolen cattle from both sides of the border could be turned into easy money. That meant the fight was not just about law. It was also about business, influence, and who got to profit from Tombstone. Then there was Johnny Behan, and that made everything worse. He and Wyatt Earp had both wanted power in Cochise County. Behan had talked Wyatt into stepping out of the sheriff's race by promising him the undersheriff job, then backed out after he got the office. That left real bad blood between them. So now Tombstone did not just have tension between the Earps and the cowboys. It also had a split in local authority itself, with powerful men pulling in different directions inside the same county. By the time the shooting happened on October 26, 1881, the town had already been poisoned by threats, pride, money, politics, and revenge. The rule against carrying guns in town was only the last spark. The deeper fight was over control of Tombstone and the county around it. Number 1. A town that died fast. Body shows one of the hardest truths about real Old West towns. A place could rise out of almost nothing, fill with money, noise, and people, then start dying before it even felt old. That was the real gamble. These towns were not built on comfort or long-term plans. They were built on the hope that the ground below them would keep paying. The second that hope started to fade, the whole place could begin to empty out. Bodie began as a small mining camp after gold was found there in 1859. For years it stayed tiny. Then everything changed in the mid-1870s. In 1875, a mine cave-in exposed a rich vein of ore. And in 1876, another big deposit pushed the town into full boom. People poured in fast. Bodie went from a place with only a few dozen people to a real boom town. At its height, it had roughly 8,000 people and around 2,000 structures. Main Street stretched for more than a mile, and the town had hotels, stores, newspapers, churches, a jail, fire companies, and a Wells Fargo bank. That kind of growth tells you what a Western boom town really was. It was a money machine built around one thing, the mine. Everything else followed the promise of gold. If the ore looked rich, people came. They opened bars, rented rooms, sold food, moved goods, chased jobs, and tried to get their piece before the rush cooled off. Bodie had the full look of a big Western town, but under all of it was one fragile truth. The town only worked as long as the mine kept making the dream feel real. Then the slide began. Bodie's decline started as the rich ore became harder to find, and people began looking elsewhere. By 1886, the population had dropped to about 1,500. The town kept shrinking through the years, and mining finally stopped in 1942. What makes Bodie unforgettable now is that it never fully vanished. More than 100 buildings still stand, and the place is preserved in a state of arrested decay, with rooms and interiors left much as people left them. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.